This is Cara Jane with Ice Cream for Buttercream, and I have been asked multiple times, how do you get your cake layers to bake up even and level? And there are multiple ways that you can go about this, and today I want to share my best tips and tricks on how to bake up even cake layers. So we're going to talk about how to add cake batter evenly to your pans and actually how to level your cakes after they've been baked. Alright, so first let's talk about some supplies that you'll need to bake even cake layers. So first let's talk about getting some good pans. So you're going to want to get some good pans for this, because if you get cheap pans, they're really not going to bake up your cakes evenly. They can distribute the heat unevenly. You get uneven cake layers that maybe are more brown on one side than the other. It's just not going to be good. So you want to spend a little bit of money. I really like to use the Magic Line pans, and I will leave a link in the description below or in the blog post for those pans. Also, you can get Wilton pans, and those will do. I really prefer the Magic Line pans, but if you have Wilton pans, that will work too. You just want to make sure that the sides of the pan are going straight up and down, that they're not kind of tilted in or tilted out. You want straight up and down layers. Okay, so next we'll talk about baking strips, and these are not a must-have. I actually don't use them personally. I just prefer to use the Magic Line pans, and that helps the cakes bake up evenly, and I don't really need the baking strips, but some people really swear by them. It's these little strips that you wrap around the outside of your pans, and they help your cake layer bake more evenly. And some people don't use the baking strips, and they'll use sort of the damp or wet washcloth method, where they'll just wrap that around and pin it together. I've just never needed that, but that's okay if you really like them. That's your choice, and I would just suggest, if you want to try them out, go ahead and do that. Maybe you prefer to use them, maybe you don't. So just find what works best for you. Okay, so the next option is a heating core, and this is what I really prefer to use instead of any kind of baking strips, but I only use a heating core on my larger cake layers. So if the cake layer is larger than maybe a 10-inch round or square pan, then I will use a heating core in the middle, and it's just this little piece of metal that you put in the middle of your pan. You pour your batter around it, and then you'll pour a little bit of batter inside the heating core. You bake it, and it sort of helps to distribute the heat, not just from the outside of the pan in, but from that little heating core in the middle out. So it bakes from both directions, from the inside and the outside. So it really helps to bake a more even cake layer, but these are specifically for larger cake layers. Okay, so the next supply would be a cake leveler or a large knife, and you may want to get both if you want. This is something that you want to use after you have baked your cake layers. If you still need to level them off at the top, you can use a cake leveler. I just use the regular, inexpensive Wilton cake leveler. It's the wire one, not the one with the sort of serrated knife-looking thing with it. That one sort of bends on me. So I really prefer the wire cake leveler, and there are more expensive cake levelers that are for different brands. I don't have one of those. I've just never needed to purchase one. But if you have a larger cake business, or you're going to be getting a lot of cake clients, then you might want to do that. I just prefer the Wilton one with the wire, and I will use that until the cakes get about 10 inches, and then after that point, you really can't use it because it's just not large enough. So you would need to switch to a large knife for that. So the next quote supply that you're going to need would be good cake recipes, and I will put some links in the description below and in the blog post for a couple of my favorite cake recipes on the blog. So if you want to check those out, be sure and do that. Okay, first let's go through the tips for baking even cake layers. So in order to bake even cake layers, you are going to need equal amounts of cake batter in each pan. And so there's several different ways you can do that. You can eyeball it, which is what most of us do. You can measure it, or you can weigh it. All right, so truth be told, I'm one of those people that just eyeball it. Maybe you can call me lazy, I don't know. But I'm just not too concerned with getting the exact specific amount of batter into each cake pan. If I was doing some kind of cake for a baking competition, I don't know. Hello, I need a Hollywood handshake. Anyway, if I was baking for a competition, or maybe it was like a semi-naked wedding cake or something, and you were really going to look at the layers and want them exactly the same, I would worry about it. But you know, just for home baking, it just doesn't. I've gotten kind of good at estimating the amount of batter in each pan, and I just go with that. But if you're baking for clients or you're giving the cake away, you really want to have your cake layers look the same amount, then you can do the other. You can either measure or weigh out your batter. So let's talk about that. All right, so measuring your batter is just like it sounds. Just use about a half a cup measuring cup and just measure half a cup per pan over and over until you've used up all of your batter. All right, so let's talk about weighing your cake batter. This one is more involved, but you're going to get a little bit more of an accurate result. So what you can do to get precise layers is to use your kitchen scale. Now you want to put your empty batter bowl on top of the kitchen scale and you want to tare it out. So push the tare button. You're basically zeroing out the weight. Set your bowl on top and you want to take the measurement. That is how much your bowl weighs. So you want to write that down. Okay, once you've made all of your cake batter, your kitchen scale is probably already turned off by now, so you want to turn it back on and zero it out and set your batter bowl on top of it. Take that measurement and write it down. That's how much your bowl weighs with the batter in it. So now that you've got that measurement, you're going to subtract the first number, which was just the weight of the bowl, from the number you just wrote down, which is the weight of the bowl and the batter included. So once you subtract that number, the number you have left over is the weight of all of the batter together. Now, if you're going to use 2 pans, you want to divide that number into 2, so you have equal amount in each pan. So if you're using 3 pans, you want to divide that number by 3. So now you just want to zero out your scale and set your pan on top of your scale, and you're just going to pour the batter in until it reaches that amount that you just calculated. All right, you're going to set your second pan on it and make sure that your scale is zeroed out. Pour the rest of the batter in and it should equal the amount that you calculated. All right, just a couple of things to note here too. You want to make sure the batter is smooth. If it's a thick batter, you want to make sure you smooth it down with a rubber spatula before you pop it into the oven. And also tapping it a little bit on the counter will help to release any extra air bubbles so that they won't rise to the surface while it's baking. Okay, before we get to actually leveling the cakes after they've been baked, I want to go through a couple of things about baking even cake layers, just a couple more tips. Baking lower and slower sometimes will help the cake not rise so much in the middle. So it's possible to get less of a dome when you bake lower and slower. And what I mean by that is generally a recipe will tell you to bake at 350 for 30 minutes or so. And what that does is that the extra heat helps the rise, and sometimes you get a dome on the top. Sometimes if you will bake at 325 for a longer period of time, you don't get that huge dome on the top. But you want to be careful about this, and you can test it out before you're actually going to have to use it for an event or something like that, because some recipes are okay with changing that, but some it really affects the texture of the cake. So just make sure to test that out before any kind of event that you have to bring this cake to. Okay, and also sometimes you can change the mixing method of a cake. You want to be careful and test that out as well, because some cakes it's really particular on how you need to mix it, and some can be changed. So in general cake recipes, it's called the creaming method, where you mix up the sugar and the butter and you whip it up a whole bunch to incorporate a lot of air into it, and that helps with the rise. But in a reverse creaming method situation, you would add in all of the dry ingredients and then you would cut in the butter, and the butter really coats the flour, and that helps the cake be able to add more moisture and sugar into the cake. And it also, the fact that the butter is coating the dry ingredients helps the cake not to be overmixed. It sort of stunts gluten development. Anyway, that's a lot of science to say that there's something about it that helps it not get that dome on the top, or at least that, in my experience, that's what I found. So you can do some experiments. I have a lot of recipes on my blog that use the reverse creaming method. I find it easier, frankly, to use that method, but it's totally up to you and whatever you find that helps you the most. But you can experiment if you like. When I first started out and I had my own place and I was baking cakes and I had a little apartment, and I mean, I've always baked cakes since as far back as I could remember. But when I was just starting out on my own, I had this little apartment oven and I was baking. I couldn't understand why my cakes wouldn't come out level. And I knew that something must be wrong with my oven because one side of the cake layer it's like it was leaning. So, and then I had, my mother finally told me, why don't you just adjust your oven? I had no idea you could adjust your oven. And in fact, all it has is these little things on the bottom of the oven that kind of screw up and screw down, and so you can just adjust the height of one side or both sides however you need. Now, I'm not sure if newer ovens have that or not. We just purchased a new oven and I haven't had a problem with that, but you might want to check your oven if your cakes are sort of leaning to one side or the other. That's really an easy fix. Okay, so now let's talk about getting even cake layers after they've actually baked. Okay, I'm going to talk about something that may or may not be a little controversial, or maybe I'm just making it controversial. A lot of people like to smash their cake layers down whenever they come out of the oven. They'll put something on there so that they don't get a dome, and they just want to make their cake layers flat. I don't really understand that. I guess I get it why they want the top flat, because you really don't want to decorate a cake that has a dome on the top. That's going to cause all kinds of issues with decorating it. But it doesn't take a lot of effort to just slice off the dome. And I'm a little bit worried about putting things to smash down the top of your cake. Won't that sort of affect the cake texture? I don't really like that. But if you want to do that and that works for you, that's great. I know that there's more than one method, and my method may not be the method for you, but I really don't like to do that. I don't want to mess with the texture of my cake. I want my cake to be fluffy on the inside. I don't know what smashing it down is going to do to it. I know what smashing down a piece of bread does to a piece of bread. It just compacts it, and I just don't want to do that to my cake. So whether or not it really does that, I don't know. I've just never wanted to try that out, I guess. I just don't worry about it. Don't worry that if there's a dome on the top, sometimes cakes will dome, sometimes they don't. So I just don't worry about that. If there are a couple of ways that you can deal with that. And those two ways are using a cake leveler or a knife to get the tops even. Okay, so this is the Wilton cake leveler I was talking about. There's different settings you can set the wire cutter to, and you just go across the top and it slices it right off. Okay, if you decide to use a knife, and if you've got a cake layer that is larger than a 10-inch cake layer, the Wilton cake leveler is not going to work for you because it's too small to go around your whole cake. So you're going to have to use a knife or get one of those bigger cake levelers. And I'm not so good at leveling my cakes with a knife. I can't really keep my knife straight, and I've seen a couple of options to do that. Sometimes people will put toothpicks around the cake, so they'll measure up at a specific height, and they'll put toothpicks as sort of a guide when they cut it. But the best sort of tip that I have ever heard, and that's worked best for me, is one from a free course that I took. It used to be Craftsy, but now it's called Blueprint, I believe. And they're not paying me to say this. I'm not sponsored or anything by them. But Joshua John Russell had one of his free courses on there. He shows how to cut and slice the top of a cake off with a knife. And how he does it is he says, lock your elbow close to your body and hold the knife out in front of you with the one hand level with the top of the cake. Put your other hand on top of the cake layer and then just sort of twist it as your slicing hand kind of stays in the same area. But locking that elbow close to your body really seems to help, and it seems like such an easy tip, but it really does help. Okay, and some other quick things to note. I just want to say, stop worrying about getting your cake layers to bake up completely flat on top. So even cake layers, that's a goal that you can go for. You want to put the same amount of batter in each cake layer pan. That's about as good as you're going to be able to do. And if the cake layers don't bake up completely flat on the top, you haven't done anything wrong. There's nothing, the recipe is not bad. You haven't totally screwed up your cake. That's the nature of cakes. You do want them to rise. Sometimes specific recipes don't rise as much as others. That doesn't mean anything's wrong or you're doing anything wrong. So stop worrying about your cakes baking totally flat on top. It's an easy fix. Just slice them right off with a knife or slice them right off with your cake leveler. If you're worried about wasting any cake, I can guarantee you that you can find people who will volunteer to eat the tops or the top domes off of your cake layers. I really don't have any problem. And sometimes you can put them in a Ziploc bag and freeze them, and you can use them for cake pops later. And also, it's really good if you crumble it over a bowl of ice cream. It's totally unhealthy, but it's so good. Anyway, my point is it can be eaten if you're worried about that, and generally you're not slicing that much off the top of the cake to have it be a big deal. If it does really bother you, go and do some experimenting. Like I said earlier, you can try the reverse creaming method, try different recipes, things like that, just to try to see and get a feel for how those particular cakes bake up. If you want to change the temperature that you're baking it at, you can do some experimenting and see what you like best. Okay, I hope that this gave you some tips on how to bake even cake layers and what to do if they don't bake up perfectly even. And don't forget to check out the other links. I'll put them in the blog post and in the description below if you're watching on YouTube. There are some cake recipes. I also have a blog post about different mixing methods for cakes that goes into the reverse creaming method a little bit more and the creaming method so that you can see what the difference is. And I also will put a link in the description on how to mix cake batter. And there is a video in real time about how to mix cake batter the proper way. Okay, my friends, I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions for me, be sure to comment below and I will be happy to help. And I will see you next time.